Hi everyone, I'm Peggy Saika, alumni of the Japanese Community Center, Asian Community Services, and the Asian Community Center. With me is Jean Shiomoto. She's the current ACC chair, and we're serving as co-moderators, but I'm really Jean's sidekick. I really wanted to thank Jean, though. Jean, Ted, my sister Gloria, and all of the current and former ACC folks who continue to hold this thread of wanting an accurate history of how ACC came to be. I'm so happy to be a part of this conversation as we weave together our stories and how we each both remember how we participated in one part of really a continuing journey for all of us as Asian Americans. And it was really created by the need to build our collective voices in order to be heard and visible in this country. I know during this process we struggled to find the right dates and the correct interpretation of the Sacramento story. But that Sacramento story was a part of a broader story that was going on across our country. And so we shouldn't get lost in just the dates, but absolutely need an accurate documentation. So between the individual stories and the timeline that's being created, right, Jean?
Yes.
That will happen as we move forward into 2022. So here's Jean, our leader.
Thank you, Peggy. So welcome everyone to the second program in a series of presentations about ACC's legacy. So I have the privilege of meeting with the panelists from the first program, the history of ACC, and this program, the story of the Japanese Community Center. This program and others ACC has planned will run up to the ACC's 50th anniversary next year, so stay tuned for more. And so before there was ACC, there were two organizations, Asian Community Services, called ACS, and the Japanese Community Center of Sacramento Valley, referred to as JCC. So due to the increased awareness in the 60s of the inequities of what society had to offer for minorities, concerned members of the Sacramento Asian community, they began to meet in the late 60s and early 70s to discuss the needs and issues in their various communities. So one outgrowth of the discussions was the formation of an organization called Asian Community Services, ACS. ACS was the first organization in Sacramento to offer programs to various Asian groups in the community. The story of Asian Community Services should be heard before this story of the Japanese Community Center, but due to a scheduling conflict, you'll hear from this great panel this afternoon, and on September 27th, you'll hear the story of Asian Community Services and their legacy. And so let me introduce our distinguished panelists who will share their involvement and memories of the Japanese Community Center from back in the 1970s. So first we have Peggy Saika, who volunteered at Asian Community Services and at the Japanese Community Center, where she was appointed to conduct the housing study to identify the needs of the Asian community. So welcome, Peggy. We have Phil Hiroshima, who is currently the legal counsel for ACC Today of Hiroshima Daggett. He was the Sacramento JCL president in the early 1970s and worked on the incorporation of Japanese Community Center. And next we have Randy Shiroi, who volunteered at ACS and JCC and worked alongside many of the people who took part in both organizations, and one of whom was Errol Shiroi, Randy's brother, and Peggy. And then we have by Zoom Harriet Taniguchi. She's zooming in all the way from Maui, so aloha, Harriet. She's another volunteer who worked alongside many of the people of the Japanese Community Center and was recruited by Earl Shiroi, Randy's brother. And Harriet was the first coordinator at the Japanese Community Center, which was her field placement as part of the Masters in Social Work program at Sacramento State University. And we have Gloria Imagire, longtime ACC volunteer, was on the ACC board in the early days for many, many years. And Gloria has been interviewing many of the people who've contributed to the Japanese Community Center and to the history of ACC, with interviewees sharing their wonderful memories. And so also Gloria and Peggy are sisters. So there's just a little bit of sibling rivalry, correcting each other. You usually hear them correcting, no, that wasn't right. No, this is what it was. So it's been really fun listening to everybody. But we're going to get started with Phil. So I'm going to ask Phil, so how did you get involved with JCC? And who did you work with? And what is significant about the JCC? Can you share that with us?
Well, this is going back in history.
Okay.
And I was involved with the Japanese community only at a local church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And one of the comments that you made that ACS was the first organization to provide services to the elderly. Well, the churches were there.
Wow.
And so the churches actually provided services to the elderly and Asian community. But I got involved at the request of Dr. Ken Ozawa, Chui Ito, Tom Fujimoto, Tom Okubo, Toko Fuji, and others, and I got involved with JACL. The Japanese community started becoming aware of the needs of the Japanese and the Asian community generally. And Japanese, when I say Asian community, I mean primarily Japanese and Chinese. And the common theme that developed was there was a cultural need between both organizations. While serving as the JCL president in 1972, there was a move. Now, this is going into the background of what the community was doing regarding Asian issues. But back in 1972, a young man approached JCL to come, and we met at the War Memorial Nisei Hall at the JCL. And this young man happened to be sitting next to me, Earl Shiroi, okay? And he came to the Japanese community, he came to the JACL and requested that somehow the JACL get involved with opposing the closure, the potential closure of the William Land School and some of the schools in South Sacramento because of the earthquake standards. And there was a bond that was being proposed by the Sacramento City Schools to improve the earthquake standards of the potential closure of the schools. And that was IJKL. And I got involved with that, and the Japanese community and the Chinese community came together to oppose the potential closure and encourage the passing of IJKL. And in fact, the Japanese and Chinese community came out so well during the many rallies that we had concerning the proposed bond, and they influenced the community significantly enough that the IJKL was the first school bond measure that passed in 30 years in the Sacramento community. And that was how I first got involved with ACS. Let me tell you a little bit about ACS from the perspective of JACL. JACL had a number of older folks involved, and I was a younger person at the time. And they had told me that the ACS group were troublemakers. They have good intentions, but they're troublemakers. But my experience with them was contrary to what the older folks were saying. And when I say older folks, at that time, they were 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I was in my 30s at the time. And my experience with the ACS group was that they were very influential in getting the concerns of the elderly into the public eye. And so we started forming a relationship with JACL and ACS. And that's how I first met Randy and Earl Shiroi back in the 70s. JCL was requested to support a proposal presented by Leo Goto. Mm-hmm. Now, Leo Goto was a former executive of the Asian Community Center. And his idea was to have a Japanese cultural center. And the Japanese cultural center, from an economic reality, was a pipe dream. And we had this grandiose ideas of having a community center and a cultural center in which the community can get together and do various things. But the reality, the economic reality is we didn't have any money. And so that was a study that proceeded. However, in that study, it was discovered that the primary needs, the immediate needs of the Asian community at that time was of the elderly. And how can we support the elderly, and what do they need? There were translation services, helping fill out Social Security requests, etc. But out of that study, it became apparent that the really primary need at that time was the need for housing of the elderly in nursing home, and how can we service the elderly. And it was at that time that the realities of a cultural center was not realistic economically.
Okay.
But there was the possibility that the government may subsidize and fund a nursing type of facility. And so that's how the idea of the cultural center shifted to the needs of the elderly and the possibility of a nursing home. What was really interesting is that the motivation of the younger generation at that time, when I'm talking about younger generation, keep in mind that JCL was a bunch of old guys running, and I'm part of the old guys now, okay? But they're run by a bunch of old guys.
We all are. We all are.
All right. And they had their ideas of the cultural center, and they liked the idea of the cultural. But the younger people, younger meaning guys like Earl and Randy, and their cohorts, they wanted to do something for the elderly people now, and the idea was that we need to get a nursing home. But realistically speaking, the Japanese could not do that on their own. Just economically wouldn't do it. And these young people, and when I say young people, I'm talking about the Earl and his contemporaries and Randy, they thought that, the only way we can get something successful is to join forces with the other Asians in the Sacramento community. And the other Asians meant Chinese, because there was as I recall, there was a nominal group of Koreans. There were no Southeast Asians. But the idea of getting the Japanese and Chinese together, number one, it's never happened before, as far as we know, anywhere in the United States. Number two, from the old folks' point of view, it's a crazy idea. It'll never happen. And when you look at the historical aspects of the Japanese and Chinese relationship, going back to in the 30s when the military expansion of the Japanese, etc., there was a lot of animus that existed between the Japanese and Chinese. But the unique thing about that concern was that the young people were not concerned with the past relations with the Japanese and Chinese. They said we can do it as a group, and what could not be done was done. And what was done was the Japanese and Chinese community came together and started looking at the needs of the elderly and the nursing home needs. Now, as part of the JCL,
can I add something to that?
Yes, go ahead.
In regards to the Japanese and Chinese working together in Sacramento, I think one of the things that is fairly unique about Sacramento is by the 1970s, you have a generation of Chinese and Japanese kids who had grown up together, gone to the same schools, so that they were already friends. And so when this concept of, well, we'd be stronger if we worked together, it made sense, and they had grown up together. Mm-hmm. So it was much easier, I think, in Sacramento to try to, realize that concept and put it into practice.
And what I look back of significance was when the Asian community came together to try to support the retention of the William Land School and other schools in the South Sacramento area, where the potential Asian kids, if the schools closed down, they'd be bussed out someplace else. And the Asian community got together and supported that IJKL bond measure that was proposed by the school board. And again, that's when I first met Earl and his group. Yeah. And Gloria just mentioned to me today that I said, somebody from ACS came to JCL requesting support, and I couldn't remember who. But then,
me.
Yeah, and it turned out to be Randy, okay? And I thank Gloria for that reminder. And that's where the Asian community, in my opinion, first got together as a community to supporting a project, which is the retention of the schools that the Japanese and Chinese kids would be bussed out if they went someplace else. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, JCL was undertaking the study of the Japanese Cultural Center and the possibility of an Asian Community Center or Japanese Community Center. But one of the concerns that I had, and I was a recent graduate from law school, and I was concerned about the potential legal liability of JACL, which we had no authority to undertake responsibilities in pursuing a community project. And so I recommended that we form a separate legal entity, a corporation, and we had much discussion over what to name it, who to include. There was a long discussion about the primary emphasis of the organization, and it had a primary interest in Japanese, but not limited to Japanese. Those were words we fought about, as you may recall back then. But we formed the corporation called the Japanese Community Center of Sacramento Valley, and later on we changed the name to Asian Community Center, and that's another story. All right?
Yes, true.
Jean.
That is.
What I recall from that time period was, so I had already been involved in Asian Community Services since the summer of 1970. So by the summer of 1971, I remember Leo Goto approaching perhaps JCL and the VFW first with this idea of building a senior housing, community youth space, and cultural center, and later pulling together a meeting during the summer of '71 that involved a broad range of groups from the Japanese community. So you had the churches, the Kenjin-kais. You had people from as far north as Penryn, Loomis.
That's right.
JCL representatives came. They had people from Stockton that came to that first meeting. And since part of what Asian Community Services was interested in doing was working with the larger Asian community, this seemed like something that ACS was trying to do also, was to work with a broad range of groups to bring about change, either to provide services or address issues. Leo was the driving force behind that first meeting. He worked for Sacramento Housing Redevelopment Agency, and as such, he, to me, had some credibility in terms of his knowledge of federal funding availability for housing projects. So he proposed that we utilize FHA, I believe, 236 program to provide most of the costs, cover most of the costs for the housing, and that the community would then have to put in a share of the cost. So with that in mind, people said, well, this seems like it might be possible. So the community groups who attended that meeting, enough of them decided that this was worth looking into further, put money together to fund a study. And that was completed at the end of, and published at the end of 1972 regarding the needs for housing and other services in the Japanese American community. So I think that Leo's vision interested enough people and caught their eye, and they thought, well, is this possible? So this pretty amazing group of people, to me, came together to investigate this further and see if we couldn't, in fact, build a senior housing and multicultural center. So
there was a really strong move on the part of the committees to explore the possibilities. And when I talk about the Asian community, I'm talking about the churches, because we had a representative from every church come to our meetings. The Kenjin-kais, for those of you that don't know what a Kenjin-kai is, there's prefectures in Japan, and when they came to America, they would form clubs and organizations to help with funeral costs and funeral arrangements, etc. And so those were called Kenjin-kais, and they were very supportive. Any Japanese clubs or otherwise were involved, and so that's what the Asian community was at that time. And as we expanded that Asian community, from a Japanese community to the Asian community, that's where the young Chinese got involved. And again, they did what no one else could think possible because of the history between Japan and China.
Well, thank you. Good history lesson here. So one of the things I want to go back is, Gloria has been going out in the community and doing these interviews. So Gloria met with Naomi Goto, the wife of the late Leo Goto, who Phil and Randy have been talking about. And she met with Naomi Goto and Courtney Goto, Leo's daughter. And Courtney shared with us the research that she's been doing on her father and his involvement with JCC and his vision. And Leo was one of the professionals, many professionals in the community who blurred the lines between their work life and private life, like Phil, who helped with the incorporation of JCC. And they leveraged their professional experience to help members of their own ethnic community. So now we're going to play a clip of the interview that Gloria did with Naomi and Courtney Goto. And Courtney just happened to be in town visiting her mom when Gloria set up the interview with Naomi. And Courtney stumbled on some newspaper clippings about the JCC that Leo saved. And so you're going to hear in this clip that Courtney was also only a toddler. She says she was only 1 or 2 when Leo was active in the JCC. So she doesn't remember much because she was just so young. But she just recently became very interested in her dad's work at the Sacramento Redevelopment Agency and at the JCC. So, but today, Courtney is all grown up and she's a professor at the Boston University. And so this video is interesting because it shows Courtney putting together the pieces of the puzzle of what her dad did, just as we are today. So let's play and hear that video.
I want to say, first of all, that, and you probably already know this from your multiple interviews of people, that everyone has these different versions of what happened, and it's a kind of mystery, a jigsaw puzzle of trying to figure out, from different perspectives, what really happened. And so, this is sort of obviously our take, or my take on this history, not having had a chance to ask my dad about these things, and now I wish I had. But I was 2 years old when he was doing this work, and I would have different questions now than I would have if I had, just knowing about this as a kid or even as a teenager. I think this is an important piece. It's called A Proposal for Japanese, and this was on his mind, and it talks about what he had in mind for the JCC. And this drawing is by Alan Oshima. But what I found really interesting was that Dad talks about, the rationale about, quote, "It is about time Sacramento's Japanese Americans start thinking about the renewing of their own heritage for the coming generations." And he talks about different models of cultural centers, and that in the late 60s and 67, presumably on his way back from Ohio, moving with Mom, they stopped in Toronto, and he was really impressed by the Japanese Cultural Center in Toronto. Another clue that made me wonder about the timing of this piece was that Dad says that wonders whether the JECL could, quote, act as a catalyst and organize a subcommittee to find out its feasibility of the center, which is sort of like, it hadn't even been a thought of the community bringing together its own ad hoc committee made up of constituents and stakeholders. He was originally thinking at this writing that it might be a pre-existing organization like JCL might take that up.
But that's the study that came out of the hiring of my sister.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting. It all kind of makes sense now,
Yes.
Falling into place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this article discusses the Cultural Center for Japanese is proposed, and just names some of the some players who were serving on various committees, like Hachi Asamura, Greg, or this is Gerald Kajitani, or Alan Oshima's mentioned, Phil Hiroshima, Frank Iwama as attorneys, and just suggesting all the stakeholders that.
And is there a date on this one?
This is 1972.
Oh, this one, yeah. So that was, January. And
Yep.
we incorporated in about March or something, I think.
Yeah. And this is also when they're thinking about hiring a project director.
Okay.
Here's the announcement for them to find someone, which I assume is, your sister Peggy
I
Saika,
think so. I
right?
think
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so that
Eventually ended
that
up-
follows along.
So really, that was really great to hear Courtney go back and talk about her father's legacy, going through the newspaper clippings. And Peggy, you were mentioned a lot that you were hired to do the study. So what's your reaction to what Courtney shared?
It's an amazing, well, it's just amazing to see Courtney respond in that way, and the work that she's doing now and pulling together and going back and looking at her father's files and all that. And it really, it all serves to, I think, document and what what Leo's, I think, vision and what his dreams really were. And I think that just building on what Randy and Phil have really shared, here was a community, though, that really was so vibrant in different parts of it. When I met Earl in 1970, I was introduced to him by Howard Nishio. They were both at the welfare department. They're social workers and all of that. And so I got involved with Asian Community Services. And by the time I think I got involved, the move had been made from Yellow House, Parkview Presbyterian, to I call it the Nishijima House
Yeah.
on 11th and V, which was right across the street from the school,
William
William
Land
Land School. And so by the time we heard about, and I think Randy had gone to a JCL meeting, heard about what JCC, or the folks, I didn't even know if it was JCC even then yet, but the idea around people organizing and coming together. And
Yeah,
right, Randy?
I don't think it was JCC. It was
Yeah.
it was just Leo presenting the idea and
yeah.
a possible means of financing
Right,
of
right.
senior housing.
Right, right.
That I think brought so many people together.
Right,
And
right. And so he became both a leader but a catalyst around it because of his position at the redevelopment agency. But if we zoom out and think about what was really going on then, what laid the groundwork for this was that you had a great president of the JCL, which are, and when you think of also that Asian Community Services had already been doing the organizing work, had identified that it was really important to organize services for seniors because we were totally left out of when you looked at what was being funded, even in the city, by Parks and Rec. Asians were not, there weren't any Asian programs. And the need was so great, and that was the legacy of even the redevelopment that came through the 50s in Sacramento that displaced a lot of the businesses that were there. A lot of them ended up on 10th Street and Riverside Boulevard, that whole corridor. And so where ACS, the office was, it became this place that was so right there in the community. And a lot of the seniors lived around there. So Mrs. Nishijima, Mrs. Maria, Mrs. Ito, all of these people started coming to the meetings, and out of needing to be, it was really the social interactions and to continue to be able to walk someplace that you could be a part of. And so, to me, all of that was laying the groundwork for what was happening at that time across the country with Kimochi in San Francisco, and there were initiatives in San Jose and in Los Angeles. And so Sacramento came together in a way, though, that was very unique. We didn't create kind of the ghettos of just one community, but more broadly, we were also a part of a movement across the country, and it just not becoming just a census category, but we really, in terms of for us to have voice, we needed to have more power. We needed to band together, and that's how the whole API framework and demographic started. So what happened? And to build, I think, on what Randy was saying, I grew up where my sister's friends were Chinese and Japanese. There were marriages. There were some businesses that were already co-owned. So we had a history, and we were not. There were recent immigrants, definitely, that kept coming, but we were also an established community without receiving any of the kind of services or participating more broadly in our city, especially with our seniors. And so to me, the study and what, really what emanated from that was really the need put together something that was data that this was community driven. This was not just a few people in the community, but a vast swath of our community that was participating and saying this is what we should do. So the methodology really for the study really was to be able to create, you know, all of these different voices, even to come together in meetings, you know, so we had a church category. So it wasn't just, you know, the Buddhist church or the Methodist church, but it was everybody. And so we had broad representation. We had civic organizations. So we had the VFW, we had the Kenjinkais, you know, David Kakishiba and Jeff Adachi. They were kids at McClatchy High School. They got involved with us. So to me, it was just the depth. So the study itself, in terms of being able to, I was going to back up and say too, and they also, the people that were coming together were going to become a part of then identifying who should bring your mailing list so we could, you know, send it out to everybody. Yes. And I think it ended up being a 10,000, you know, that were sent out, all within the Sacramento Valley Japanese American community. But it was really a way to be able to say, yes, this is the documentation that we had. If we needed to, it wasn't just, you know, individual community voices, but this is what was heard. And what was heard and what we documented was the need for housing. And really, in many ways, even though I know Leo loved and really wanted a community center, in some ways, that's what ACC's become, right? It's, you know, it really is in multiple ways. It's become a community center. But at that time, the need was for housing. And I remember people used to ask me at that time, you know, how come you're involved with all of these, like, you know, the bus trips with the seniors and all these, you know, and supporting like the Tanashimikai or, you know. And I said, oh, I want it to all get set up before I get to that age. So I want to be involved, you know. I know one day I'm going to get there and I want to be all set up by the time I get there, so here I am. Yeah, and so I think it was really such an inspiring time, a time that really in our country, like I said, you know, we're trying to find voice and power and all that. And we were making, in the words of John Lewis, making good trouble. And I'm, you know, my sister is the matriarch of our clan and our family. So, you know, I'm the baby, so I'm the spoiled, you know, one that goes off and makes trouble. And so there I was, activated. But and I'll say, all of this, when you think about it, for many of us, you know, I was activated by organizers that came from the colleges and came from. You know, it was Earl and others, you know, that were working in the county. So we had people, like I said, you know, from academia, so not just the students, but the profs, not just medical students as volunteering at the free clinic, but really the profs in the medical school. So, and we had civic leaders, and we had someone like Leo. You know, someone like Leo, I wish he was here today, he'd be excited about this conversation, but that was heading up the redevelopment agency, a major, so it gives you a sense of when we all work together from across all of these sectors, but we're led by and responding to community need, good things will happen. Yeah. And I think that's really what we were trying to do with the study and with JCC and what hopefully led to, you know, ACC.
Yeah.
One of the things that impressed me about Courtney's comments about her dad is how he tried to motivate others to be involved. Yeah. And what impresses me in retrospect, looking back after 50 years now, is that the quiet Asian, okay, that we were stereotyped as a quiet Asian, non-troublemaking or otherwise. And I was told that these guys were the troublemakers. Okay?
You're pointing to Randy.
I'm pointing to Randy, okay? But the key issue was people became aware of the need, number one.
Yes.
They recognized the need, and they started getting involved.
Yeah.
And that's where the start of the success of ACC and JCC is the volunteers, because those are the people that made it a success.
Yes.
And if you had the quiet Asian sitting at home, stereotypically, we would not be where we are today.
Right.
But
Correct.
those volunteers came out and did what they thought was insignificant, but it was meaningful.
Well,
Yeah.
significant for this community to
Oh,
where we
yes,
are
yes.
today.
Yes.
And when I hear from everybody and talking, and that you said that the Asian community was not getting the funding for any services for the seniors, for the elderly, and that's where you recognize that there was no place to gather, there was no services, and so you wanted to, and you identified how to fill that gap.
Right.
And
Correct.
came together and got both, a lot of the community, Chinese, Japanese, come together and met, and you guys have talked about going on bus trips and eating together and sharing food, and that's how people continue to bond.
Yes.
And recognize the need for these services, and that also came out of the study that you did.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
The housing, really, that's really, first it was the vision, Neil's vision of the cultural center, but then the study showed that there was a need for housing for the seniors, for the elderly. There was
Yes.
lacking in Sacramento.
Yes, yes, yes. And it really cut across, like, Phil, it really cut across, it was multi-generational.
Correct.
Because it was young and old, And so I remember when, and Phil has reminded me, he was one of the people who interviewed me. And you won't remember this question, but one of the questions they asked me was, they said, Peggy, if you work for an Asian organization, why would you want to come back and work for a Japanese, project, right? And I said, I remember I responded, I said, I don't make those distinctions because I know at my core I'm a Japanese American, I'm an Asian American, I'm an Asian American woman. All of those complexities, and they are a part of how I see myself. And so I don't feel like it's going back to anything. It's actually powering up that part of our community, right?
Because you
And who
believed
I
in
am.
what the community needed, not
Yes.
so much of what you are,
Yes.
but the belief from everybody that we've talked to is that the belief in the community for the better for the Asian community and the elderly, for the seniors.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so many times, and Randy and others will remember this, but really seeing Japanese and Chinese elderly on those bus trips, sharing food and going. One bus trip we went to Angel Island, and Mrs. Okada, who was her, the Yorozu on Riverside
yes.
Boulevard. It was before Angel Island was all, rebuilt
Oh,
and
yeah,
reorganized and everything. But the main place was there. It was like the, where you go when you
First
you go on the
arrive
island.
on the island.
And there were these photos, and I think those photos they've changed, but there were a lot of photos. And Mrs. Okada said, I was here on Angel Island. I went through Angel Island. And the other elderly Japanese were saying, how do you remember that? How do you know that? And she says, because that's me in the picture.
Oh, wow.
And they said, how do you know that's you? It was this young, beautiful, she was a beautiful senior, but I mean beautiful young woman. She says, because I still have that kimono.
Oh, wow, nice.
And that became a front page story in the Sacramento Bee, But it was just so, I mean, it just made all of us move forward and become really, do more, right, moving forward. So it's a beautiful time.
One comment that I don't agree with Peggy is that those young people, again, the troublemakers I referred to,
Yeah, these two.
they were looking for power.
Yeah.
The JCL was not looking for power. The church community was not looking for power. They were wanting to serve the needs of the community. And so we had different goals. They wanted power. We wanted to get some results. And so we had some conflicts. But as I indicated earlier, that I was told early on that don't associate with those guys. There's nothing but trouble. I'm serious.
And now you're sitting here with them.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
But I was told that they were trouble. And so, let's do our own thing. And when they came and asked for help from JCL and then later on JCC, the Japanese Community Center, we reached out to them and joined forces, recognizing there was a need of the community, not a need for an organization. And
Gloria.
Randy, you may comment on some of my comments.
Gloria.
I want to chime in on this. I interviewed Margaret Fujita the other day. She's the Fuji restaurant person. And, I didn't realize that she had she was going to school. She had a degree from the San Francisco Art Institute, and then she went back to San Francisco and she got her master's in fine arts. But she followed Randy and Lily. She knew Lily, I think. And so she was teaching ceramics at William Land School. And she told me they had a kiln right there in the center of the building or something. But then she talked about, she did it for all those years, you know, moving from the school to the Tambara house, and she was still doing it when pandemic came. But she talks about how much fun it was, how much joy those you know, elderly got.
Right.
And then it was really touching about, you know, not being able to understand the Chinese. And she doesn't speak Japanese much either, but she just had
did
such a
it.
great time.
Yep.
And I told her, I said, boy, you really brought a lot of joy into their
Absolutely.
lives.
Absolutely.
But she really kind of did away with her own career to do that, you know. She never did anything with that.
You know,
So
Jean.
I think the class you're talking about.
I don't want the thought. She mentioned ceramics.
Yes.
Okay, and that was part of the big issue of closing the William Land School, and also the change from the permitting of the Tambara garage.
Yeah.
The ceramics was a big issue.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we helped fight those issues. I'm sorry, go ahead, Randy.
But that's where power comes into play.
That's right, that's right, okay, that's right.
Unless you can put the numbers of people together to, like in this case, pressure the school district to rebuild William Land School, and you wouldn't have the school, you wouldn't have different services there. So it's not one or the other.
Yeah.
They're
They're
interrelated.
both. That's right.
Well, you guys Phil was talking about two troublemakers on the panel, but good trouble.
Thank you, Jean.
You know, I heard that word, and there's always good trouble. And so, Randy, you know, what I want to focus on you is that, you know, you worked alongside Peggy at ACS and JCC, and then you've both worked in both organizations, ACS and JCC, and Phil says, you know, he viewed you guys as rebel rousers, but really had good intentions. So what were the characteristic differences between the two organizations? But it looked like you guys had a common thread for the good of the community, which led to services and programs to ACC. So can you talk about that?
If there was anything that might have stood out, it would have been that Asian Community Services and trying to bring attention to different issues or needs would be willing to publicly picket a business or an agency. Whereas a lot of people in the community thought, well, that's, you know, going a little too far. We did nothing illegal. The picketing was perfectly legal. But it did draw attention, and I don't believe there had been any other groups doing anything like that in Sacramento.
Right.
So that might have made some people uncomfortable.
Right.
So we recognize that,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
also recognize that, you know, there were people who wanted to, you know, provide services, wanted to see improvements in what was available
Yeah.
to the seniors, to immigrants.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just need to do those things
Yeah.
to, you know, heighten people's awareness
Awareness.
of the issue.
To be
Yeah,
seen and heard?
Yeah, you know, I think that's really true, and just even listening to Phil too, you know, about, it was really about shared leadership, that you could, you know, to me, when you talk about our community overall, you know, like, but the common goal was really being in service to, you know, as Phil said, but how we had to organize to be able to achieve that goal. Otherwise, you know, then our community is neglected, right? And so even in we talked earlier about the Lamb Park School, you know, the closure, you know, the organizing around it was, I just remembered, remember the ABC, the Asian Black Chicano Coalition, it was the ABC Coalition. I mean, it's really dated when you think about it now, but it's because, you know, when we were bringing people to the school board meetings, you know, there was people couldn't understand. So we had to ask for, you know, interpreters, to be, you know, to provide for them to provide. Now it just seems so passé in many ways, but at that time, it was a request so that everybody in the community could participate, right? And I think over and over again, if anything, I think we've learned that around building voice and all that, what it means and what it takes.
Yeah.
You don't know how many times I had to advocate for ACS that they had
Yeah.
credibility.
Yeah.
And they're not a bunch of rebel rousers.
See, but that's what we mean by leadership, though. If Phil hadn't done that on our behalf because he could see that we could both respond to community need, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the power of voice and presence, that's exactly, you're the classic example of that, you know?
But you know, Phil, the one thing I always stress is that, you know, some of these names are going to be forgotten.
Yeah.
But do you remember Jun Miyakawa
Yes.
and Masao Itano
Yeah.
and Jonel Suzuki? They were established members of the Japanese community.
That's right.
And they agreed to serve on the board.
Yeah.
And they gave our
That's right.
organization credibility.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they're in some of these pictures, too. You know, oh, I'm going
Yeah.
to start crying.
Yeah.
I love them all so much, you know?
Well, I think, you know, hearing from everybody, and you guys remember, some of them are passed on, but some are still here. And,
Yeah.
I'm really grateful that, you know, Gloria, you're going out and doing these interviews because they're so precious. And you guys talk about that. And so one of the things I wanted to cover was, you know, Leo's vision was to build that Japanese community center, but, you know, the funding, there wasn't enough funding to go forward with that. And so it kind of moved on to housing. So how was it that, how did it affect you guys? You had to shift from Leo's vision to housing. And I think that's where it went to these community meetings, the big meeting, getting everybody together and going to the city and to asking for, the city asking for money. But, you know, how did that affect you guys?
If I can comment very quickly,
Sure.
I don't think our vision ever changed.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I agree.
So can you elaborate on that? So it went from, so really what ACC today is really cultural, right? I guess, because we have programs, lifelong learning, started out with the nursing home, you know, the senior skilled nursing, and then we moved into senior housing and assisted living. And along the way, we continue to offer the programs. Different programs, we don't offer ceramics, but there's knitting, there's singing. Ted does a lot of the singing classes. So you're right, the vision really never really changed then. You guys kept it going.
Yes, and from a practical economic point of view, we went to where the money was the potentially easiest. And then from there, we recognized the expansion of those services. And that's how ACC now currently has all the various programs and classes, etc. But if it wasn't for the nucleus of the Asian, the nursing home, that was an impetus for all of that.
Yeah.
It would not have happened.
That's correct, that's correct. Well,
So, are you referring to that period in 1973 when federal
yeah,
housing
the
funds
federal
were frozen?
money got pulled back.
Yeah.
Right.
So-
I
So the
remember
fun-
that.
Yeah. The funding that Leo was looking at utilizing, those monies were frozen by the federal government
Correct.
and were never restored. So at that period, in 1973, you had this, from my perception, was an amazing, group of people from the Japanese community who were broadly connected, were well-established members of the community. And it would be a shame for the group to just say, well, we can't do this because there's no federal money available, and to just have the group dissolve. So I think this is where the Asian Community Services part comes into play, because ACS already had a senior recreation program going, had secured funding from the city recreation department to get the kiln to start that ceramics class. And it made sense that long-term, the Japanese Community Center would be very well suited to maintaining those programs and carrying them on. So that's where the ACS transitioned all those programs
Programs over to JCC.
JCC.
Talking about the economics, and I don't mean to minimize their role, but ACS was getting funding for the Tambara Garage, $25 a month. Okay, they were getting funding to improve the electricity in the Tambara Garage to get the kiln up to snuff.
Well, that's actually JCC.
Okay,
At that
but
point.
the point is, you know, their efforts were to have these local issues, and that was fine. But we were looking at multi-millions of dollars, you know, of how are we going to build a nursing home, and that was the issue that I was concerned about is if you undertake an obligation and incur potential liability, who's going to pay it back, and all these other things. And that's where the community came together to raise money, number one, to recognize a need to get the support of the churches, Kenji Kais and others. I mean, there was a significant support.
Right.
And so from my perspective at the time, is that you guys had a meaningful input, but they were looking at the local issues of helping the Gold Club or the ceramics or whatever. We're looking at the
Broader
community-wide project that was multi-millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And so you know, we had, like Gloria says, we had members on our board that were prominent individuals in the community that gave our organization credibility. And that's what we still strive for, is that we want to have a credible board, we want to have credible people advocating a position that is meaningful. And so, and again, not to minimize the role,
No.
but you know, relatively speaking, you're looking at pennies, we're looking at major dollars.
Right. That the nursing home is the big overarching goal that you
Right.
want to achieve,
Yeah.
and but it's hard to say, well, we're going to raise money for 10, 20 years, and at the end of that, we'll build something. If you have no other activities going on.
Oh, yeah, I
in the
agree with you
interim.
100%.
Right.
Agreed.
So
Right.
that's
Right.
where the transitioning of the existing recreation program
Right.
to JCC seemed to fit in well with,
Right.
gave you something to work on that was positive now, that addressed some of the needs of the seniors, but allowed JCC to continue working towards the larger goal of
Yeah.
building the nursing home.
Yeah.
And when you look at it in retrospect, their efforts have grown into hundreds of classes for ACC now.
No, it's not.
I'm
all the-
serious.
it's all the hundreds of people that came
That's where it all
afterwards.
started.
Yeah, we offer, ACC offers a lot of classes.
That's right. And that's where it all started.
Offer online, like today, we have an online program to share with everybody.
You have a student. Yeah.
So what I want to do now is, Ted got hold of some photos, and we're going to go down memory lane, and Ted's going to bring up some of these photos, and so let's see who can remember who is in those photos, and see who some of these handsome folks are, and see if you can remember who they are.
That's hot. Should I see?
I think that's hot.
Is that,
right?
is that?
There's May. There's May, and I think that's
That's
hot.
hot. That is
and
hot,
May.
definitely.
Yeah.
That's the
Maylee?
only one I recognize.
That's not Winston in the top right, is it?
No.
He was a young kid when he first got
That's
involved.
true. Everybody says Winston got involved when he was really young. Abby Wong, that's who it is?
Okay.
He was a social work student.
That is Winston in the background?
Is that
No,
what?
No?
he was a social work student, Bobby Wong.
Oh, okay.
That's just the only one I recognize.
And you'll hear from Hotch on the next program in September. He's going to host that.
You?
She had long hair then.
The
Is
front one?
Oh,
They
yeah.
had.
I don't
had
think
long
I ever
hair.
knew
Oh,
you
you
when
can't
you
see
had long
everybody.
hair.
Okay, so who's in here? What's this fun group here?
You know, I looked at that earlier, I can't figure out why.
Susan Gong is
The
in
one
there.
on the right,
Me.
the second from the right is Jackson Yoshizuka, and why is he in this picture?
That was a car. This is one of Carl Shu's pictures, but
Yeah, the one in the front is Chewy, and right behind him is Chiz. And Lorraine Mizuno is behind.
And I'm there too.
Are you in there?
Oh, May says she's here. in the photo too. She's sitting in the audience.
Yeah, I'm in that flower.
And
I was
everybody's
in there
having
too.
food. So this says JCC Open House circa 1977. Did you guys cook any foods or?
Steve Koyasaka was in there, yeah. Oh, and this is the Goto class.
So who took classes to Goto? Did you, Peggy? Did somebody, I
Your
thought,
mother
mention?
did. Your mother played the koto.
No, she didn't. She didn't play the
I thought
Goto,
she
but
did.
she
I
didn't.
never
But
knew they had Goto classes.
yeah,
at
they had Goto
JCC.
classes with, yeah.
Is that Mrs. Moria back then?
I'm not sure.
And so this is a picture of where you say the Chinese community coming together and meeting with JCC in 1977.
Yep,
And this is where you get the different ethnic groups coming together.
right. Yep.
Oh,
And
boy.
who are
Randy
these
and
young,
Peggy.
handsome, beautiful people?
Oh my God.
That's Randy and Peggy,
Oh my
Right, yeah.
the
God.
dynamic
Like they're
duo.
15 years
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. Randy, you found that photo?
Yeah. I still have the article. I still have my research.
Oh my God.
So it was really nice to look at those photos and go down memory. Thanks, Ted, for bringing those up. So now we're going to chime in and talk to Harriet, who's in Maui, and she's zooming in for us. And I'm going to ask Harriet some questions. So Harriet, you were recruited by Earl Shiroi, Randy's brother, into JCC. And you've talked about writing proposals and getting grants. You've also talked about the Kanji Nishijima House across from William Land School, where the JCC office was, and then moving over to the Tambara House. So how did Earl get you involved? And tell us about the activities at the Nishijima House and the Tambara House.
Thanks for doing this. It's really heartwarming to have a history of the organization. I had met Earl when I was a social worker for the welfare department, and I was the Japanese-speaking social worker and went on for the master's degree at Sac State. Earl recruited me to be the coordinator, and you talked earlier about transitioning from Asian Community Services to Japanese Community Center of Sacramento Valley. So our first office was at 1117 V Street. And when the limited services were transferred, that's when I was involved with the organization. And at that Kanji Nishijima House, we had Asian Legal Services. Andy Noguchi, I remember coming once a week, and we had a regional occupational program student come and to assist us in the office. So we provided limited social services, continued what ACS had established. And later, we were able to, as mentioned earlier, move to the Tambara House in Southside Park. And we had to get zoning exception because that was a residential area. And so, there was a lot of work that was involved. Phil helped with us on that as well. And we did the proposal to Sacramento City Recreation Programs, asked for 30,000, got 15,000. And that's how we were able to renovate the house as well as convert the garage into a classroom, establish the kiln. I remember that was a huge project that was installed in the back of the classroom. So with the Go Club, the Goto, Sumi, calligraphy, Mrs. Wakayama came by. And of course, Margaret, they loved Margaret's ceramics class. And she did she fired everything there, at the center. Ted Kobata was just extremely helpful in terms of renovating, the entire house, bringing it up to code, as well as converting the garage. I have to give Earl Shiroi a lot of credit for recruiting a lot of the MSW, Masters in Social Work students to come to the center. And it became like an incubator where all of the students did a lot of community organizing. We were, through Sac State, able to secure a National Institute of Mental Health grant, which provided stipends for some of the students. So this is where Asian Resources, Mei Lee, Asian Pacific Community Counseling, were established Kenji Morishige helped establish the Tanashimi Kai, the nutrition program at the Buddhist church. And so many of the familiar names, Hachi Yasumura, Meili, Jun Oto, were all part of the social work program. And again, credit to Earl for getting us organized and really becoming involved with community organizing and identifying the needs, with the community and establishing, relevant programs. I remember getting involved with the United Way boycott. I think Randy alluded to that in one of our meetings. Now, after I finished the placement, I was recruited to serve on the board of directors. So I was on the board for 6 or 7 years subsequently. And that's where we, really got involved with the emphasis on establishing the nursing home project. We continued the social services component and the recreation program, but the emphasis was establishing the nursing home. So I still remember Francis Lee, and I know this will be covered later, stepping up and saying, I will be the coordinator for the bingo program. And that was incredible. And her husband helped Francis in that effort. And that's where the organization raised a lot of money to support and augment, the grants that were eventually received to establish the nursing home. So again, credit to everyone, all of the participants, all of the community organizers, all the leaders within the community. We all came together. And it's true that I even participate in some of the programs now that are offered through ACC. So Peggy, yes, I'm at that era too. So again, it's been an incredible journey. We learned a lot in terms of community organizing. And I think that's where as well, many of us went on to other professions and still kept the community in mind. And so again, it's a lot of influence on individuals, and we're able to contribute a lot to the community.
Well, thank you, Harriet. Thank you for sharing that. We really appreciate the work you did, especially for social work. So thank you for joining us from Maui. But so Randy, when we were talking and exchanged a lot of emails, you shared a thought that I want to share with everybody, that the JCC and ACC came about at a time when people around the country in the 70s were questioning the status quo. And Peggy, you talked about that, looking for ways to improve their communities and the society. And what you've heard today, and you will continue to hear, is that many community leaders, like we have here today, the countless volunteers that Phil talked about, individuals contributed to ACS and JCC and the building of ACC of what it is today. And you stated that history is made by the people and not one individual. And we talked a lot about Leo and we talked about Earl, but really you shared that it was the community coming together, a lot of individuals. So, today's panel and the panel on the history of ACC and the one that's going to come up on the story of the Asian Community Services is a reflection of that. And many people came together collectively and brought their professional skills, their background, their talents, their time to meet and plan for the program services for the seniors. And that there is the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. But I think what we've heard from everybody from the panel, that it takes a community to build ACC.
That's true.
Right?
Absolutely.
I coined that phrase over the weekend. It gave me some thought. It really gave me some thought, because Randy was saying these emails and said, no, you didn't get it right. This is what it is. So I really appreciate that. But kind of to close this up, what do you think that Earl, Leo, and all the other people that you mentioned who made these significant contributions to ACS and JCC, how would they react to ACC today? Because we have a skilled nursing home, the Care Center for the Seniors, we have lifelong learning programs, this is what it is today. This is part of the lifelong learning program. Senior housing, we have RISE, our transportation, we have caregiving support services, that we do support groups, and we have Meals on Wheels providing meals to seniors in the community. So that's just to name a few of what ACC does. So how do you think they would respond?
I'm going to go first because I'm the oldest. But I think it would just blow their mind. You know, we came from such humble beginnings. Remember when we used to have to sit on those couches with the springs poking up because they were all donated? And we used to have to clean the latrine after those gold men. You know, if you were on the board, that's what you had to do.
Yeah.
And you had to go weed the garden. I mean, it was all kind of junky stuff, you know. And now they're in these nice conference rooms and everything. I mean, Leo and Earl, I mean, they couldn't even imagine where we are now. But you know, Leo, before he went, he said, "You have to get this history right." And I kept saying, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah," and I kept putting it off. And as you know, I'm getting older, and I thought, my gosh, he's going to come back to haunt me if I don't get something going here. I think he would be satisfied that, you know, we didn't write a book or anything, but we're getting it done so that we could tell the story. Yeah.
Since I'm the second oldest,
Yeah.
I think that what would be, if Earl were here today, I think he'd tell me, "I told you we're not a bunch of rebels," because we had that discussion. We had that discussion many times.
You did?
Of how the older people perceived ACS as a bunch of rebels. And he would say, "I told you we weren't a bunch of rebels." That's what I think he'd
What do you
say.
think you say? Randy, you want to comment on anything of how your brother would think about this?
Yeah, he'd probably say, well, keep moving forward, keep, you know, evaluating the community. Everything changes, the needs change, and as long as you remain responsive to the community and the conditions, then ACC will continue.
Oh, great. Peggy, any thoughts?
Yeah, that's such a good question. But I think that for Earl, the bigger we become in materially, you know, like more housing and all that, it's really great because it's in response. And then the other side of it is how we keep activating ourselves and opening doors for others, with others.
Yes.
You know, and to do that kind of, continue to do our organizing and kind of our advocacy work too, you know, organizing and advocacy work, not to speak on behalf of people, but how do they, you know, most impacted communities speak for themselves. And I think that was always the dream. So that kind of effort, I think, would be, you know, moving forward. I think we all want to be able to see that, you know, that, you know, we're in Sacramento, but there's larger, like, issues across the country and around the world, and how do we connect, keep staying relevant, you know?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's
How do we
right.
keep staying relevant?
Harriet, do you want to add anything? You're in Maui. You have to unmute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, great. I also echo the fact that we should keep our eyes on the needs of the community. You know, it's not just for one individual, but like Leo, Earl, you know, all of us, we've always felt the need to address the needs of the community. And I think going forward, as mentioned earlier, you know, we should identify needs within the community. And as Gloria mentioned, it's not, you know, just those old furniture and getting new furniture, but fulfilling the needs of the community is very critical. And I think all of the organizers would be very, very proud of what, you know, we have all accomplished collectively. So those are my thoughts. Thank you very much for organizing this. I always thought that we should do a history and had participated earlier, but somehow it was never all put together. So thanks, Jean, to all of you for organizing this.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to Gloria for being the impetus in getting this going.
You know, I want to say one more thing. I just feel that with people like you and all the people you have surrounding you, it's in really good hands.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been a lot of work.
She's the original troublemaker.
Yeah, but you know what? I think we're all reliving history. We're all learning that collectively you put all the minds together, we're filling in the blanks.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people said, I don't remember this. And then, no, that's not right. And it's really fun listening to you guys talk over each other and correct each other. So for me, it's been a real history lesson, and I'm humbled to be able to participate and learn from you guys. So again, this is, I really want to thank the panelists, Peggy, Phil, Randy, Gloria, and Harriet from Maui for coming together and telling us about the JCC story. We've learned a lot. I look forward to the next panel, which is going to be on September 27th, which is hosted by Hach Yasumura and Jun Oto. They're going to tell the story of the ACS, and they're not good trouble, good rebels. And
They should have you on that panel.
You should have Peggy there.
and so, I hope you've enjoyed this show. I've enjoyed it. We've learned a lot about the history, and it's our way of documenting everything. And so we've got a lot of paperwork coming in. Phil documented what he shared with us. We're going to put it into Ted started a Dropbox where all that history is going to go. At some point, we're going to work together to get it down on paper and share it. But these audio videos, Gloria's been going out and doing these interviews that are just wonderful. And she doesn't know, she's a natural at interviewing. But again, I want to thank the panel. Thank you, Harriet from Maui. But again, thank you, everybody. And thank you for the viewers for joining us. And tune in on September 27th for the next show, the story of the Asian Community Center. So thank you so much today, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Wow.